White governments don't want intelligent, critical thinking black populations. They instead only want black populations that are just smart enough to work, pay taxes, entertain them, fill up their sporting arenas, and fight within their unjust wars. But black populations that can be easily mentally enslaved by them. Our core problem is that the mentally enslaved ones are stubbornly unaware of their own mental enslavement, and they therefore fiercely fight against those of us who try to free their minds from their mental enslavement. Nonetheless, we must continue to teach the truth, even though the mentally enslaved ones have been brainwashed to hate and fight against those of us who try to free their minds. Because we must tell the truth regardless, because we are called to awaken the sleeping sheep, not to appease the mentally enslaved goats. Those who know must teach, African proverb. An absolute fact is that when people know better, they do better. Likewise, when people are made aware of the dangers that confront them, they always remove themselves from those dangerous situations. You don't even have to tell them to do so. The gained awareness of the danger causes them to automatically remove themselves from it. People automatically remove themselves from harm's way as a means of their self-preservation. It's an inherent response within the human psyche. This is why the most effective way to implement harm against a large targeted population is to do so while keeping it outside of their awareness. This is precisely what oppressive forces have done to black people. Not because most black people are unaware of how we're still being subjugated and oppressed, doesn't mean that we are no longer being subjugated and oppressed by the white society. We've merely been made intellectually and psychologically blinded from seeing how it's now being continued. When the blatant subjugation and oppressive tactics deployed in the past against the black population resulted in massive unified black protests, white oppressive forces did not abandon those practices. They instead merely developed more covert methods for doing so. They developed methods that are covert, more sophisticated way of subjugating black people, methods that are not easily recognized nor easily comprehended by most of their black victims. Doing so allows white oppressive forces to continue their subjugation and oppression of black people without any significant black resistance. White subjugation and oppression of black people always works best when the black victims no longer recognizes how it's being done. To further add insult to injury, in addition to developing a more covert way of subjugating us, they've also spread lots of false knowledge into our communities to keep us distracted from recognizing the covert methods that are used for subjugating us. False knowledge is extremely harmful to the oppressed, because an ignorant mind consumed by false knowledge is far worse than an ignorant mind without false knowledge. Because an ignorant mind without false knowledge, might continue to seek to find the liberating truth. But an ignorant mind that has been fed false knowledge, thus believing it's true, stops searching for the truth and therefore becomes mentally enslaved by the false knowledge. This is why the black community is now drowning in so much false information in regards to our plight and condition. In addition to developing covert methods for continuing their subjugation of us, they fed us lots of false knowledge into our minds in order to prevent us from learning of those true hidden subjugation tactics that are currently being deployed against us. So therefore, instead of seeing the plight of our truth, our minds are stuck in believing in biblical fairy tales and silly slave syndrome myth, and we believe that we're the true indigenous Americans, and all of these many false knowledge and false narratives. In order for an oppressed people to truly liberate themselves, they must first gain a clear, concise, and accurate understanding of their plight and condition. Because if our understandings are flawed, then all of our liberating strategies and remedies that stem from those misunderstandings will also be flawed. This is why all false knowledge must be exposed and eradicated. The oppressed must function based upon what is actually true in order to develop the proper counter strategies that are necessary in order to truly liberate ourselves. This is why those who know the truth must teach. African proverb. The truth of our plight and condition is that Black people have been socialized and trauma bonded by the white society. That's socialized and trauma bonded by the white society. We are also the unknowing victims of the most elaborately deployed ideological subversion system in history. Ideological subversion is an offensive propaganda psychological warfare tactic that uses disinformation and misinformation as a weapon to manipulate targeted populations to think in ways that are against their own self-interest and instead in ways serving the interests of those that are deploying the ideological subversion system. Through a nefarious ideological subversion system, Black people have been brainwashed to exclude our oppressors from all analysis regarding our oppression and to blame ourselves for our oppression. As I said, Black people have also been trauma bonded by the white society. Usually the term trauma bonded refers to a gaslighting mental abuse that occurs within abusive relationships wherein which one partner is being manipulated and mentally abused by a narcissistic partner. Within that scenario, it's when after repeatedly brutalizing the victim, the narcissistic abusive partner never acknowledges any of his wrongdoing. He instead minimizes the abuse and tells his victim that the abuse wasn't that bad, so just get over it. Shut up and get over it. He then constantly inundates the victim with demoralizing, disapproving narratives about the victim. This is continued until the victim stops focusing on the abuse and instead focuses only on the demoralizing, disapproving narratives. This causes the abused victim to, rather than resenting the abuser, he will instead, or she will instead, seek the approval of the abuser. This trauma bonding effect provides the abuser with a more favorable outcome rather than having the victim hating and resenting him for the abuse. The human mind is easily manipulated when the victim is unaware of what's being done to their minds. It's a well-proven gaslighting tactic. Likewise, this same trauma bonding, abusive, manipulating tactic is what white social engineering scientists and white propagandists have deployed against Black populations on a larger scale. After brutalizing Black people for many centuries, the white establishment never acknowledged any of their horrible wrongdoings. They instead insist that the abuse of Black people wasn't that bad. They tell Black people to just shut up and get over it. It wasn't that bad. And then it constantly inundates Black people with Black demoralizing, Black racially devaluing, disapproving narratives about ourselves. Therefore, rather than resenting the white society for their brutal mistreatment of us, many of us instead tries to win their approval. Many Black people will go out of their ways to try to show white people that we're not all bad. See, I'm different than the rest of them. I'm different than them. We try to get their approval. Black people are with an abusive relationship with a narcissistic white society. And just like with an abusive relationship, they've convinced many Black people to believe that their mistreatment of us is our own fault. It's a psychological mind hack. The minds of targeted populations are quite easy to manipulate if they're unaware of what's being done to them. Once minds have been confused, manipulation becomes simple. The mind will even ignore common sense and rationality falls away, even overlooking hypocrisy and deception. Black people have also been socialized by the white society. Socialized is when the oppressors exploit their monopoly over information that are fed into the minds of the oppressed to manipulate the oppressed to think in ways that are benefit of the oppressors. Socialized is how oppressors prevents the oppressed from seeking retribution against the oppressors. And although most Black people have never even heard of the term socializing of the oppressed, those who have been socialized rarely ever learned of that practice. However, it's actually a very common practice. Throughout history, those empires that were brutally oppressive, fearing eventual retribution from those they brutally oppressed, have always socialized their minds to prevent the oppressed from seeking retribution. Therefore, the perceptions held by the oppressed are never truly their own. They're always a false perception beneficial to their oppressors that was shrewdly ingrained into the minds of the oppressed by their oppressors without the oppressed even realizing it. There are 4 ways to effectively manipulate the human brain: by what we see, by what we hear, through repetition, through what we see, through what we hear, through repetition, and what we're taught, education. Because the white society controls the education we're taught, the media images we see, the societal narrative we repetitively hear, these factors allow the white society to manipulate the minds of black people to think in ways that are against our own self-interest, in ways that serve the interest of the white society and are against ourselves. They first began socializing our minds during our early educational development, when our minds are young and most impressionable, through educational curriculums that denies us of virtually all black racially affirming facts about ourselves. This conditions us to perceive ourselves through a false, inherent, inferior identity that psychologically conditions us to perceive ourselves through a subordinate status that makes us more accepting of subordinate status within white dominant society. This makes us more compliant with white dominance over our lives. They also socialize us through unrelenting media subliminal programming. Media subliminal programming are messages embedded in the media that are designed to bypass the conscious mind and become embedded into the subconscious mind without the targeted population even realizing it. The white media's unrelenting negative depiction of black people that amplifies the negative to the point that it distorts our reality is designed to subliminally embed the message into our collective subconscious minds that we black people are now our own worst enemies, and that we therefore need whites to govern over our lives. Moreover, that black people should admire, respect, and trust only whites. This subliminal programming is extremely effective because when black people are repetitively presented those noticed subliminal messages from trusted white media sources, it can be very difficult to resist its implied subliminal programming, especially when the subliminal programming is being reinforced daily and so unrelentingly. It's the true reason why many black people are now self-loathing, perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres Caucasians in spite of such a brutally horrific history of the contrary. The oppressed will always believe the fraudulent worst about themselves. As you know, it's a quote from Frantz Fanon. Regardless of how intelligent people are, if it's possible to control the input into the human mind, it's entirely possible to control what people will believe. The white society exploits their monopoly over information we believe to shape our minds in a way that serves them. This propaganda campaign also demoralizes us, divides us, creates black self-loathing, and shifts black collective aggressions away from the white oppressive society and redirects it towards ourselves. This also attacks the core foundation that bonds us as a people, and we can then be ruled over forever. The problem has never been a silly slave syndrome myth. That's merely false knowledge that's being used to distract us from learning of this truth that I'm disclosing. This psychological warfare system demoralizes the black population to such an extent that we begin to doubt our own ability to govern ourselves and believe that we therefore need white people to govern over our lives. And it makes many of us believe that we're better off living under white dominance. Therefore, we abandon all hopes of ever liberating ourselves. It's the true reason why many black people no longer yearn for black liberation, but instead now only yearns for a comfortable position within the system of white supremacy. The white society has exploited its monopoly over the information and media images that are systematically and repetitively fed into the collective minds of black people to make us think in ways that serves their white society. This is the truth of our plight and condition. This is not victim peddling, as so many of you have been socialized to respond and to think. It's the absolute truth. Black people are the unknowing victims of the most successful mental enslaving system in world history. The truth has finally come forth, but they brainwashed millions of us to reject it and to hate those who speaks it. Until we break the monopoly the white oppressors have over our minds, our liberation is not only impossible, it's unthinkable. That's a quote from Neely Fuller Jr. It's time to elevate your mind. To put it really simple, it's time to stop believing dumb shit. When we assign our true oppression onto a biblical fairy tale and a religious myth, we are making damn fools of ourselves. It's time to wake up.